الحاجات دي تبقى كلها كابت بقى في اللايبرري ان شاء الله. فالسموكينج، النيكوتين والالكول الاثنين نفس الفكرة. they stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. الالكول كمان in addition to stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. I just want to make بس sure ان انا I am recording. لا الحمد لله I am recording. Okay, so alcohol in particular not only stimulates the sympathetic system, but it prevents the brain centers in the brain from turning on the parasympathetic system. فالحقيقة هو طبعا this explains why people مثلا heavy smokers and alcohol consumers take nicotine and alcohol because they feel in هما they focus more. This is just because of increased adrenaline in their body. طبعا when you have more adrenaline in your body, you are more alert, you are more focusing, and the pain threshold is higher. You feel pain less, so you feel more comfortable, you feel more euphoric. But on the long run, this elevates the blood pressure. When you have chronic stimulation of the sympathetic system, then you have a chronic increase in the heart rate, you have a chronic increase in the cardiac output, and a chronic constriction in the arterioles, and therefore a chronic elevation of the total peripheral resistance. طبعا it's well known that there is a correlation between obesity and being overweight and the elevation of the blood pressure if you are genetically predisposed. Why? Because when you're overweight, you have a greater muscle tissue, a greater, not really muscle, but fat tissue. And all this mass of tissues, whether they are muscles or fat, need energy. So of course, fat needs less energy, but it needs to store energy. So the body is dealing with a greater mass, and therefore the heart has to pump more blood to this huge mass, which is the obese person. So again, the heart has to increase the cardiac output, the heart rate, in addition to the fact that there will be, of course, when you're obese, this means that you have an over or a surplus of energy, and this surplus of energy will be deposited in the walls of the blood vessels as fat, and therefore you will have stiff blood vessels, which, as we explained before, would help elevation of the blood pressure. In secondary hypertension, we have an underlying disease. Usually it's a kidney issue. It's either a chronic kidney disease or a renal artery stenosis. I start by renal artery stenosis. The renal artery is the artery that arises from the aorta and supplies oxygenated blood to the kidney that contains the nitrogenous waste to be filtered. If you are obese, or if you have a surplus of cholesterol in your circulation, then there will be deposition of plaques or atheromatous plaques or atherosclerosis in the blood vessels. And in addition to this, what we are concerned with here is the renal artery. So actually stenosis means narrowing, but sometimes stenosis is due to constriction. But here stenosis is not due to constriction, it's due to deposition of plaques that result, of course, in narrowing of the diameter and therefore diminishing the blood flow. So the word stenosis is a bit misleading because stenosis in medicine usually refers to like constriction because of muscular contraction. But more importantly, vasculitis. This is not, why am I saying more importantly? This is not because it's more common, but because it's more dangerous. Vasculitis usually occurs as an autoimmune response of the body. And what's really dangerous about vasculitis and about autoimmune diseases in general, that vasculitis can affect any blood vessel. So it can affect blood vessels in the brain and can affect blood vessels in the kidney. So when there is vasculitis, there is an autoimmune inflammation in the walls of the blood vessels with all the consequences, histamine release, increased perfusion from the capillaries, dilatation of the capillaries, exudation, accumulation of white blood cells. So all this would lead to swelling of the walls of the arterioles and therefore diminished blood supply. The other thing is a chronic kidney disease. A chronic kidney disease is like, for example, glomerulonephritis or any other kidney disease, that nephrotic syndrome, which is another autoimmune disease that we haven't studied in grade 10, any chronic kidney disease, whether it is an immune disease or a tissue injury due to a stone, for example, will diminish the ability of the kidney to carry out its filtration functions. And therefore, there will be, especially in the first stages, there will be like retention of water and salts. And the retention of water and salts results in increased volume of blood. And therefore, as we said before, increased volume of blood will be associated with increased cardiac output, which is one of the factors that, one of the three major factors that elevate the blood pressure. But in addition to this, when the tissue of the kidney is damaged or diseased, the kidney starts secreting an enzyme that is normally secreted by the kidney, which is called the renin enzyme. But in this case, it would be increased with higher levels. And renin is not working alone. Renin is working with two other substances, which are angiotensin and aldosterone. You needn't know their names, but that ultimately result in elevation of the blood pressure. How? By constricting the arterioles. When you increase constriction of the arterioles, you are increasing the total peripheral resistance. The third important factor is that the injured renal tissue is not a normal tissue, and therefore it will secrete abnormal proteins that are toxins and that are released into the renal circulation, and that result in inflammation of the walls of the capillaries and renal arteries. And inflammation, as you know, will be followed by narrowing. If you find that the patient has hypertension and you are looking for a secondary or an underlying cause, then you should also test certain hormones, because sometimes secondary hypertension is related to hormonal disorders. Primary aldosteronism. Aldosterone is one of the hormones that I was talking about that is related to renin. It's called renin angiotensin aldosterone system. The three are related to each other. Maybe one day we would understand how. Aldosteronism, increased aldosterone levels might be due to kidney disease, but there might be unrelated. It might be primary aldosteronism, meaning that the elevation in aldosterone is primary and you do not know what the cause is. Similarly, thyroxine. When thyroxine released by the thyroid hormone is elevated, it does not really result in the normal hypertension we know, but it results in what we call hyperdynamic circulation, meaning that during systole, the systolic blood pressure is elevated, and during diastole, the diastolic blood pressure is diminished. So you have a big difference between the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure, and an increased pulse pressure, and this is characteristic of hyperthyroidism. So it's not that both the systolic and the diastolic pressure are elevated, but it's an elevation in the systolic pressure associated with a diminution in the diastolic pressure. The third hormonal disorder is related to sleep apnea. If you remember, we studied sleep apnea in the respiratory system. What happens during sleep apnea is that the patient wakes up every now and then because he feels obstructed. So there is disruption of the normal hormonal rhythm that occurs during sleep. There is, as we said before, a diminution in the sympathetic hormones, the stress hormones, an elevation of the neurotransmitters related to the parasympathetic system, an elevation of melatonin hormone that is related to sleep. When you wake up every now and then you are disrupting all this. As we said, there are certain medications like cortisone that elevate the blood pressure, but there are other medications that are less known to elevate the blood pressure, and they are over-the-counter drugs, and this is serious because people can use them without medical prescription, like pain relievers, like decongestants. This is very important when you have a runny nose and your nose is stuffed and you cannot breathe. So we might give you either systemic oral decongestants or even nasal drops that are, at the end of the day, absorbed from the nasal mucosa and elevate the blood pressure. Antidepressants, of course, this is not over the counter, but or certain addictive drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine. Um, a very important factor that results in secondary hypertension is preeclampsia. Preeclampsia is a serious, potentially fatal condition that occurs during pregnancy in some females around the 20th week of pregnancy at the beginning of the 4th month, where we find that all of a sudden the female suffers from severe headache, blurred vision, maybe vomiting, lower limb edema. If you do a urine analysis, you will find albumin in urine. And if you, of course, it's a routine to measure blood pressure for all patients that visit your clinic. So when you measure the blood pressure, you find that the blood pressure is elevated and the renal function is disturbed. This is what we call, in Arabic, we call it tasammum haml, toxemia of pregnancy. But the medical term is preeclampsia, before eclampsia, because eclampsia means that the patient would lose consciousness and this would be fatal. So when you find that the patient is hypertensive, this is an emergency condition, and most of the time the female will be aborted, whether intentionally or unintentionally, because you have to save the mom, and you might get rid of the baby in order to save the life of the mom. You of course will give antihypertensive drugs. The cause, but sometimes these drugs are not efficient, so you have to abort the mom. And the cause is that usually the placenta, that is the vascular disc-like structure that connects the fetus to the uterus of the mom, is not deeply implanted in the uterine mucosa. When the placenta is not deeply implanted, it does not stimulate the uterine arteries to dilate, and therefore it does not receive enough blood. So the placenta is stressed. We call it a stressed placenta because it does not receive enough oxygen and nutrients. And this placenta, of course, cannot support the life of the fetus throughout the coming month of pregnancy. But more importantly, it releases toxins, just like any stressed tissue, just like the stressed renal tissue release toxins. The stressed placenta will release toxins that would damage the blood vessels of the mom, cause inflammation, vasoconstriction, and therefore sudden shooting of the blood pressure. Hypertension in Western communities is a leading cause of death because, as we said before, it imposes strain on the wall of the blood vessels, and therefore it causes friction, it causes clotting over the sites, the rough sites of friction, or it might cause the blood vessel to burst and result in intracerebral hemorrhage, like here, for example. This is hemorrhage inside the brain matter, and this is one of the most serious types of hemorrhage. Sometimes there is epidural hemorrhage here, in between the membranes, or subdural hemorrhage under the dura mater, under the membrane, the outer membrane around the brain. This is less serious, but the intracerebral hemorrhage is, of course, very serious because it damages a good deal of the brain substance. As we said before, sometimes there are no symptoms, or the patient gets acquainted to the symptoms, and therefore we call it the silent killer. The most common symptoms, if any, are headache, of course, and it is headache at the back of the skull, in the occipital part of the skull, just above the neck. Sometimes tinnitus, زي وش كده, heard in the ear, dizziness, and in severe cases, when there is increased tension inside the brain, the patient might complain of blurred vision or even vomiting, or chest pain, because it induces myocardial infarction, of course, due to constriction of the blood vessel. When you treat a patient, you first treat it using general measures. You restrict salt in the diet for a week. You advise the patient to lose weight. You give sedative medications to calm down the patient. And for a week, if the blood pressure does not drop, you give diuretics that increase the urine volume and therefore help the patient to get rid of the surplus volume of fluid, water, and salt. And if all this fails, you start giving medications that dilate the arterioles. But we have to start first by the general measures. I think we have only like 3 minutes before the end of the meeting. I don't recommend starting angina pectoris now because it would be interrupted. Maybe, inshallah, on the next session, we would discuss angina pectoris and then see whether we are going to pursue our human biology sessions and take the nervous system, or start AP biology, or start ACT, as you like.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Malak.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
You're welcome. Do you have questions?
I don't think I have any questions now.
Okay, if you have any question, just send them on WhatsApp, please. And then please tell me when you want the next session, whether it is human biology or whatever else, inshallah. Okay? See you. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.